The courthouse stood tall and imposing on that chilly morning in Detroit, its weathered stone facade a silent witness to countless stories of justice and injustice. Among the stream of people entering its heavy doors was a small figure, a 12-year-old boy wearing a borrowed suit that hung loose on his thin frame. The boy's grandmother had spent hours the night before pressing that suit, her weathered hands moving the iron back and forth with practiced determination. She had raised him since he was 3, working 2 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads in one of the city's toughest neighborhoods. Inside the juvenile courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The boy sat quietly, his feet barely touching the floor from the hard wooden bench. His court-appointed attorney shuffled papers beside him, having spent only 15 minutes with his young client before the hearing. This wasn't unusual in the overcrowded juvenile justice system, where cases often moved through like items on a conveyor belt. The charges seemed straightforward enough: shoplifting food from a local convenience store. Third offense. The store owner had pressed charges this time, frustrated by recurring incidents in his struggling business. But there was more to this story than what appeared in the police report. When the judge called his case, the boy stood up, his shoulders straight despite the fear evident in his eyes. The judge, a veteran of 20 years on the bench, had seen thousands of cases like this. Or so he thought. He began his usual stern lecture about responsibility and consequences, but something made him pause. Maybe it was the way the boy maintained eye contact, showing respect but not submission. Or perhaps it was the quiet dignity in how he stood, so different from the usual defiance or defeated slump he saw in his courtroom. Whatever it was, it made the judge set aside his prepared speech and ask a simple question: "Son, can you tell me why you're here today?" The boy's response was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the hushed courtroom. "Sir, I was hungry." A simple statement, but there was more. Encouraged by the judge's attentive silence, he continued, his voice growing stronger. He explained how his grandmother had fallen ill 3 months ago. Her arthritis had worsened to the point where she couldn't work her second job as a cleaning lady anymore. The medication she needed ate up what little savings they had. He tried to help by doing odd jobs around the neighborhood, mowing lawns, running errands for elderly neighbors, but it wasn't enough. "I tried to make the food last," he explained, his voice catching slightly. "I'd eat at school through the free lunch program, and sometimes my teachers would give me extra snacks. But when the weekend came..." He trailed off, his composure wavering for the first time. The judge leaned forward, his usual stern expression softening. "What about your school counselor? Did you tell them about your situation?" The boy shook his head. "I didn't want them to call social services," he admitted. "They might take me away from my grandmother. She's all I have, sir. And she needs me too." The courtroom remained silent as the boy shared how he would portion out their food, making sure his grandmother ate first. How he learned to ignore his own hunger pangs. How he started staying late at school to use their computers, searching online for resources and assistance programs, but many had long waiting lists or required documentation they couldn't provide. His last words hung in the air: "I know stealing is wrong, sir. My grandmother taught me better than that. But watching her skip meals so I could eat. I just couldn't bear it anymore." The judge sat back, studying the young face before him. In that moment, he wasn't seeing just another case number or another troubled youth. He saw a child forced to shoulder adult responsibilities, trying to navigate a system that had failed him and his grandmother in fundamental ways. The story of this young boy would soon challenge not just the judge's perspective, but the entire community's understanding of juvenile justice, poverty, and the true meaning of right and wrong. It would raise questions about society's responsibility to its most vulnerable members and spark a chain of events that would change many lives, starting with the boy standing bravely in that courtroom. As the judge considered his next words carefully, no one in the courtroom could have predicted how this case would unfold, or the ripple effects it would have throughout their city. This was just the beginning of a story that would touch hearts, challenge consciences, and ultimately lead to unexpected transformations in their community. The boy stood there, waiting for judgment, unaware that his simple truth would set in motion events that would not only change his life but inspire a movement for change in juvenile justice and community support systems. His story was far from over, in fact, it was just beginning. The judge's chambers fell silent as he closed the case file on his desk. Through the window, he could see the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the courthouse steps where the young boy had stood just hours earlier. The case had struck a chord deep within him, bringing back memories of his own childhood in Detroit's working-class neighborhoods. Instead of following the usual protocol, the judge had made an unprecedented decision. He'd postponed sentencing for 2 weeks, but not for the usual reasons. "I need time," he had told the courtroom, "not to consider punishment, but to find solutions." The boy's court-appointed attorney had watched in amazement as the judge pulled out his personal phone during the recess. The first call went to Dr. Richards, who ran the city's largest food bank network. The second was to Mrs. Thompson, a retired social worker who now coordinated a coalition of community organizations. By the end of that afternoon, the judge had assembled an impromptu task force of local leaders, all moved by the boy's story. Word spread quickly through the courthouse corridors. A clerk who had been present during the hearing shared the story with her church group. A security guard mentioned it to his wife, who worked at the local news station. By evening, the story had reached Carol Bennett, a successful restaurant owner who had grown up in the same neighborhood where the boy and his grandmother lived. Carol couldn't sleep that night. The boy's situation reminded her of her own past, the nights when her single mother had gone to bed hungry to ensure her children could eat. The next morning, she walked into the judge's chambers without an appointment, her determination getting her past the surprised secretary. "I have a proposal," she announced, placing a folder on the judge's desk. "That boy doesn't need punishment. He needs opportunity." Meanwhile, the boy's grandmother sat in their small living room, worried sick about her grandson's future. The ancient radiator clanked and hissed, struggling to keep the winter chill at bay. She hadn't been able to afford the medication for her arthritis that month, but that was the least of her concerns now. A knock at the door startled her. Opening it, she found Mrs. Thompson, the social worker the judge had contacted, standing there with several folders and a warm smile. "Ma'am," she said gently, "I think we can help." Over the next few days, their small apartment became a hub of quiet but intense activity. The food bank delivered weekly meal boxes. A local doctor, moved by their story, offered to treat the grandmother's arthritis at no cost. Carol Bennett's restaurant began providing hot meals every evening, delivered by her staff who soon became familiar faces at their door. But the most significant change came from an unexpected source. The convenience store owner, the same one who had pressed charges, showed up at their apartment one evening. He had been born in Vietnam and had fled to America with nothing. The boy's story had reminded him of his own struggles when he first arrived. "I was wrong," he told the grandmother, his voice heavy with emotion. "I saw the act but not the reason behind it. Not the person." He offered the boy a part-time job at his store after school, not as punishment, but as an opportunity to earn money honestly while learning about running a business. The boy's story began to ripple through the community in unexpected ways. A local tech company donated computers to his school's after-school program. A neighborhood watch group organized a food pantry. The local credit union started financial literacy classes for families in crisis. When the 2 weeks were up, the courtroom was packed. The boy stood straighter now, the same borrowed suit fitting a little better on shoulders that carried less weight. Behind him sat not just his grandmother, but a growing network of community members who had become invested in his future. The judge looked around the courtroom, noting the diverse faces united by a common purpose. He saw Carol Bennett sitting next to the convenience store owner, both now members of a newly formed community support network. Mrs. Thompson from Social Services sat with Dr. Richards from the food bank, their heads together as they discussed expanding their programs. "Young man," the judge began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "2 weeks ago, you stood here and told us the truth. Today, I see a community that has come together because of that truth. Your actions were born of desperation, but your honesty has sparked something remarkable." He paused, making eye contact with the boy. "This court's decision is as follows: you will complete 6 months of mentored work experience at the convenience store. You will participate in the new youth leadership program that Mrs. Bennett has established. And most importantly, you and your grandmother will continue to receive the support services that have been put in place." The judge leaned forward, his voice softening. "But here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to label you a criminal. We're not going to punish you for trying to survive. Instead, we're going to help you thrive." Tears rolled down the grandmother's cheeks as she clutched her grandson's hand. The boy remained composed, but his eyes shone with a mix of relief and determination. This wasn't just about avoiding punishment, it was about being given a chance to become something more than his circumstances had allowed. 3 months had passed since that pivotal day in court. The convenience store's bell chimed as customers entered and exited, its familiar ring now a comfort to the boy who stood behind the counter, carefully counting change. Mr. Tran, the store owner, watched with pride as his young employee handled each transaction with growing confidence. "You see that display by the window?" Mr. Tran asked during a quiet moment. "I want you to redesign it. Show me your ideas tomorrow." The boy nodded, already mentally sketching plans. What had started as simple tasks like stocking shelves had evolved into learning about inventory management, customer service, and now visual merchandising. But the real transformation wasn't just happening inside the store. The boy's story had sparked a quiet revolution in the juvenile justice system. The judge, inspired by the success of this case, had started a program called Second Look, requiring all juvenile cases to be evaluated for underlying social needs before proceeding with traditional sentencing. One afternoon, while organizing stock in the back room, the boy overheard Mr. Tran talking to another young person, a teenager he recognized from school who had been caught attempting to shoplift earlier that day. "I know someone who can help," Mr. Tran was saying softly. "There are people who want to support you, programs that can assist your family. You don't have to do this alone." The boy smiled to himself, remembering when he had stood on the other side of that conversation. At home, things had changed too. His grandmother's health had improved significantly with proper medical care. The apartment felt warmer, not just because they could now afford heating, but because of the community that flowed through it. Every Tuesday, she hosted a support group for other grandparents raising their grandchildren, sharing resources and stories over cups of hot tea. The boy's grades had improved dramatically. With proper nutrition and support, he could finally focus in class. His math teacher had noticed his aptitude for numbers, developed through hours of calculating inventory and managing stock, and recommended him for advanced classes. Carol Bennett's youth leadership program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a small initiative now served 50 young people from similar backgrounds. The boy found himself mentoring newcomers, sharing his story not with shame, but as a testament to the possibility of change. One day, a local news crew arrived at the store. They were doing a feature on community transformation and crime reduction. Mr. Tran had agreed to be interviewed, but only if they focused on the solutions, not the problems. "Before, I saw only what I was losing," Mr. Tran told the reporter, glancing at the boy who was efficiently managing the register during the busy afternoon rush. "Now I see what our community can gain when we invest in our young people." The camera caught a moment that would later become symbolic of the program's success, the boy teaching another teenager how to properly count inventory, both of them laughing as they discovered a missing box of candy bars behind a shelf. The story aired on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, Phone calls were pouring into the courthouse from business owners across the city, wanting to know how they could participate in similar programs. The judge's office could barely keep up with the inquiries. But it wasn't just local anymore. A state senator had seen the news piece and reached out to the judge. "We need to make this systematic," she said. "What happened in your courtroom shouldn't be the exception, it should be the standard." The boy learned about this development while sitting at Carol Bennett's restaurant during his weekly mentoring session with younger kids. He was helping a 10-year-old with math homework when Carol turned up the TV volume to show the senator speaking about juvenile justice reform. "That's because of you," Carol told him quietly. "Your courage to tell the truth that day in court opened doors that had been shut for too long." The boy shook his head modestly. "It wasn't just me," he replied, wisdom beyond his years evident in his voice. "It was everyone who chose to listen and help instead of just judge." That evening, walking home with his grandmother from her doctor's appointment, they passed the courthouse. The setting sun painted the old building in warm hues, so different from the cold, imposing structure he remembered from that first morning. "I'm proud of you," his grandmother said, squeezing his hand. "Not just for turning things around, but for helping others do the same." The boy squeezed back, thinking about how different things were now. The hunger that had driven him to steal was gone, replaced by a different kind of hunger, a desire to learn, to grow, to help others find their way out of desperate situations. Later that night, as he helped Mr. Tran close the store, they counted the day's receipts together. The older man paused, looking at his young employee with thoughtful eyes. "You know," Mr. Tran said, "when I first came to this country, someone gave me a chance when I needed it most. I didn't understand until now that sometimes the best way to repay such kindness is to pass it on." 6 months after the judge's innovative ruling, representatives from 5 neighboring cities sat in Detroit's main courthouse conference room, eagerly taking notes. The judge, along with Carol Bennett and Mr. Tran, was explaining how their community intervention program had reduced juvenile offenses by 40%. The boy, now appointed as a youth advisor to the program, sat quietly at the end of the table. He wasn't scheduled to speak until later, but his presence alone carried weight. He was living proof that understanding and support could transform lives more effectively than punishment. "The key," the judge was saying, "is to look beyond the offense to see the whole person." "When we encountered this young man," he gestured respectfully toward the boy, "we didn't just see a case number. We saw a child trying to survive, a grandmother fighting illness, a family caught in circumstances beyond their control." A city council member from Cleveland raised her hand. "But how do you fund all this? In times of budget cuts, it's hard to justify new programs." Carol Bennett leaned forward, her restaurant's success giving authority to her words. "Actually, it costs less than incarceration. We've calculated that for every dollar spent on community support and intervention, we save $3 in future judicial and correctional costs." The boy listened intently, still amazed at how his personal story had sparked such widespread change. Just yesterday, he'd helped another young person enroll in the program, a girl who had been caught stealing warm clothes for her younger siblings. Instead of facing charges, she was now connected with winter clothing donations, and her mother had found work through the program's job placement network. During the lunch break, the boy gave the visitors a tour of Mr. Tran's store, which had become a model for community engagement. The security cameras that had once caught him stealing now recorded training videos for other youth entering the program. The store's back room, previously just for storage, had been converted into a small classroom where participants could do homework and receive tutoring. "Before this program," the boy explained, his voice steady and confident, "I thought I only had 2 choices, watch my grandmother suffer or break the law. Now I understand there are always more options, but sometimes you need help to see them." Back at the courthouse, the afternoon session focused on expanding the program. The state senator who had championed their cause appeared via video call, announcing that the state legislature was considering a bill to implement similar programs statewide. They were calling it the Second Chance Initiative. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Some critics argued the program was too lenient, that it sent the wrong message about accountability. The boy addressed these concerns in his afternoon presentation, his words carrying the weight of personal experience. Accountability isn't just about punishment, he explained, looking each skeptic in the eye. It's about taking responsibility for making things right. This program taught me that I'm accountable not just for my actions, but for helping others avoid the same desperate choices. After the conference, the boy walked home through the early evening darkness, his mind full of the day's events. He passed the spot where he had once hidden stolen food in his backpack, remembering the gnawing hunger and fear. The memory no longer brought shame, only determination to prevent others from facing the same choices. At home, he found his grandmother hosting an impromptu gathering of program participants' families. Their small living room was crowded but warm, filled with the smell of shared dishes and the sound of supportive conversation. A mother was explaining how the program had helped her find steady employment. Another grandmother was sharing resources for managing chronic illness on a limited budget. The boy's grandmother, her health much improved, orchestrated it all from her favorite armchair, dispensing wisdom and encouragement in equal measure. "See what you started," she whispered when he bent to hug her. Later that evening, the judge called an unexpected meeting with the core team. They gathered in Carol's restaurant after closing time, sharing concerns about a new challenge. The program's success had brought attention from politicians and corporations wanting to take control, to standardize and scale it in ways that might lose the personal touch that made it work. "We need to grow," the judge acknowledged, "but without losing our soul." The boy, fighting sleep after the long day, straightened in his chair. "What if we let each community shape the program to fit their needs?" he suggested. "The core principles stay the same, but the details adapt." Mr. Tran nodded approvingly. "Like my mother's recipes," he said. "The essential ingredients never change, but each cook adds their own touch." They worked late into the night, developing guidelines that would allow the program to grow while keeping its heart. The boy contributed insights from his perspective as both a former participant and current mentor, his understanding of both sides proving invaluable. As midnight approached, Carol noticed the boy struggling to keep his eyes open. "Time to call it a night," she announced. "We're not just building a program, we're building a movement. That takes time, and it takes all of us being at our best." Walking home under the streetlights, the boy reflected on how far they'd come. The hunger that had once driven him to steal had transformed into a force for change, not just in his life but in his community and beyond. Each step forward revealed new challenges, but also new possibilities. 1 year had passed since that first day in court. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the state capitol building as the boy stood at the podium, his grandmother beaming proudly from the front row. The gallery was packed with supporters, journalists, and legislators from across the state. "I stand before you today," he began, his voice clear and steady, "not just as someone who was given a second chance, but as proof that when we choose understanding over punishment, miracles happen." He was testifying in support of the Second Chance Initiative, which would make community intervention programs mandatory across the state for first-time juvenile offenses. The boy's testimony painted a vivid picture of transformation, not just his own, but his entire community's. He spoke about the weekly youth leadership meetings now held in Carol's restaurant, where former program participants mentored newcomers. He described how Mr. Tran's store had become a model for other businesses, with 5 more stores across the city now offering similar apprenticeship programs. But it was when he talked about his grandmother that his voice softened with emotion. "My grandmother taught me that true strength isn't in hiding our struggles, but in reaching out to help others through theirs." Today, she runs support groups for families facing similar challenges. "The same woman who once had to skip meals to feed me now helps coordinate food distribution programs throughout our neighborhood." The legislators listened intently as he shared statistics. juvenile crime rates down 40% in participating neighborhoods, school attendance up 35% among at-risk youth, and an 80% reduction in repeat offenses for program participants. During the lunch break, a young state representative approached him. "Your story reminds me of my brother," she said quietly. "He made a similar mistake at your age, but his judge didn't see beyond the offense. He's still struggling to overcome that felony record 15 years later." Back in Detroit, the original program continued to evolve. The judge had transformed an unused courtroom into a resource center, where families could connect with support services before their cases ever reached a hearing. Social workers, job counselors, and mental health professionals worked alongside legal advisors to address root causes rather than just symptoms. Mr. Tran had expanded his mentorship program to include basic business education. Sometimes, he told the boy during their morning inventory check, preventing crime is as simple as showing someone how to build something of their own. The boy's own role had grown too. At 15, he was now the youngest member of the Youth Advisory Board, helping shape policies that would affect thousands of young people across the state. His experiences, both the struggles and the successes, gave him a unique perspective that adults in the system valued. One afternoon, while helping a new program participant learn the inventory system at Mr. Tran's store, the boy noticed something familiar in the younger child's eyes, the same mix of fear and determination he had felt that day in court. "You know," he said, setting aside the clipboard, "when I first started here, I was terrified of making mistakes. But Mr. Tran taught me something important. It's not about being perfect, it's about being better than you were yesterday." The success of their program had attracted national attention. Delegations from other states regularly visited to learn from their model. But what impressed visitors most wasn't the statistics or the systems, it was the sense of community that pervaded everything they did. Carol Bennett had expanded her restaurant's youth program into a full-scale culinary training institute, offering professional certifications alongside mentorship. "Food brings people together," she often said, "but purpose keeps them together." The boy's grandmother, now a respected community elder, had become a powerful advocate for families navigating the juvenile justice system. Her living room remained a gathering place, but now it was officially recognized as a neighborhood support center, complete with resources and regular visits from social service providers. One evening, as the boy helped his grandmother sort through donation items for new program families, she found an old photo taken just after his court hearing. "Look how far we've come," she said softly, comparing the uncertain child in the borrowed suit to the confident young man before her. "We?" he asked, smiling. "Yes, we," she insisted. "Change never happens alone. It takes a village to raise a child, but sometimes it takes a child to raise the village's consciousness." The next morning, the boy arrived early at the courthouse resource center. A new family was coming in, their situation eerily similar to what his had been. As he prepared to share his story once again, he realized something profound: the shame and hunger that had once defined his life had transformed into tools for change. A news crew was setting up in the corner, preparing to document the program's one-year milestone. The reporter asked him what made their program different from traditional juvenile justice approaches. "In the old system," he explained, "the question was, what law did you break and how should you be punished? In our program, we ask, what challenges are you facing, and how can we help you overcome them?" That change in perspective makes all the difference. 18 months after the original court hearing, the boy stood in front of a mirror in a Washington, D.C. hotel room, adjusting his tie. This time, the suit wasn't borrowed, it was a gift from Mr. Tran, tailored perfectly for his growing frame. He was preparing to speak at a national conference on juvenile justice reform, where representatives from all 50 states had gathered to learn from Detroit's success story. His grandmother sat on the hotel bed, watching him with quiet pride. Her arthritis was well managed now, and she had become something of a celebrity in their community, the grandmother whose love and determination had helped spark a national movement. "Remember," she said softly, "just speak from your heart, like you always do." The conference hall was packed with judges, lawmakers, and social workers from across the country. The boy noticed some skeptical faces in the crowd, people who believed that traditional punitive approaches were the only way to handle juvenile offenses. But he had learned that the best way to change minds was through stories and results. He began his speech not with statistics, though they had plenty of impressive ones to share. Instead, he started with a story about a recent program participant, a young girl who had been caught stealing school supplies because her family couldn't afford them. Today, he told the audience, she's not only excelling in school but has started a supply-sharing program for other students in need. This is what happens when we choose to address the root causes rather than just the symptoms. During the Q&A session, a tough-looking judge from Texas raised his hand. "This all sounds good in theory," he said, "but what about repeat offenders? What about kids who don't want to change?" The boy paused thoughtfully before responding. "In our experience, sir, most young people do want to change. They just need to see a path forward. In the rare cases where someone doesn't engage with the program initially, we've found that peer mentorship often makes the difference. Sometimes, they just need to hear it from someone who's walked in their shoes." Back in Detroit, the program continued to evolve. Carroll's Culinary Training Institute had partnered with a local community college to offer college credits. Mr. Tran had helped 3 former program participants open their own small businesses. The Courthouse Resource Center had expanded to occupy an entire floor, with services now including mental health counseling, job training, and educational support. One afternoon, shortly after returning from Washington, the boy received an unexpected visitor at Mr. Tran's store. It was the convenience store owner who had first pressed charges against him, but not to check on his progress. The man's nephew had been caught shoplifting in another state, and he wanted to know how to advocate for him to receive the same kind of opportunity. Sometimes, the boy found himself saying, echoing Mr. Tran's words from long ago, "The best way to repay kindness is to pass it on." He spent his lunch break helping the man draft a letter to the judge in his nephew's case, explaining the Detroit program and its success. The national conference had brought unexpected challenges and opportunities. Major corporations were offering funding, but some wanted to reshape the program in ways that might compromise its core values. Politicians saw it as a winning issue, but there was a risk of the program becoming a political football. The original team gathered at Carroll's restaurant after hours to discuss these challenges. The boy, now considered an equal partner in these discussions, proposed a solution. What if we created a charter? A document that lays out our core principles that any participating community or organization must agree to maintain? The judge nodded approvingly. Principles like what? Like never losing the personal touch, the boy suggested. Every participant needs to have a real relationship with their mentors. And we need to maintain the focus on family support. We can't help the kids without helping their families too. They worked late into the night, crafting what would become known as the Detroit Principles, a framework for maintaining the program's integrity while allowing it to grow. The boy's grandmother contributed wisdom from her support groups, Mr. Tran added insights from his business mentorship experience, and Carroll shared lessons from her culinary training program. As the program expanded nationally, success stories began flowing in from other cities. A group of former gang members in Los Angeles had started a youth outreach program based on the Detroit model. A judge in Atlanta had transformed an abandoned school into a community resource center. A small town in Maine had adapted the program to address rural poverty and isolation. The boy's role continued to evolve. At 16, he was now helping train other youth advocates, teaching them how to share their stories effectively while maintaining their dignity. Your past challenges don't define you, he would tell them, they equip you to help others. His grandmother's support groups had grown into a national network of family advocacy organizations. When we help one child, she often said, we help generations to come. Her living room remained the heart of their local community, but her influence now reached far beyond their neighborhood. One evening, as the boy walked home from a training session, he passed the courthouse where his journey had begun. The imposing building no longer seemed intimidating, it had become a symbol of transformation. The security guards greeted him by name, and the halls that had once echoed with fear now buzzed with hope and possibility. Reaching home, he found his grandmother hosting a video call with support group leaders from across the country. They were planning a national conference of their own, focused on family advocacy and support. As he listened to their passionate discussion, he realized that their story had become something larger than themselves. It had become a blueprint for change. 2 years to the day after that first court appearance, the boy, now a young man of 17, stood in the same courtroom where his journey began. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood the judge, Mr. Tran, Carol Bennett, and his grandmother, all facing a room packed with journalists, community leaders, and program participants from across the country. The occasion was the official launch of the National Youth Justice Alliance, a nationwide network of community-based intervention programs built on the foundation of what had started in Detroit. The Department of Justice had just released a comprehensive study showing that cities adopting their model had seen juvenile crime rates drop by an average of 50%. 2 years ago, the boy began his speech, his voice strong and clear. I stood in this very spot, hungry and afraid. Today, I stand here with a different kind of hunger, a hunger to see every child in crisis receive the same chance I was given. He paused, looking around the familiar room. But this isn't just my story anymore. It's the story of thousands of young people who have discovered their own power to change their lives and their communities. The evidence of that change was everywhere. The courthouse that had once been a place of judgment had transformed into a center of hope. The Resource Center now occupied 3 full floors, offering everything from mental health services to job training. The waiting room that had once been filled with anxiety and fear now buzzed with the energy of possibility. Mr. Tran's small convenience store had become the flagship for a network of business mentorship programs across the country. When I first agreed to give this young man a chance, he told the gathered crowd, I thought I was doing him a favor. Instead, he showed me how to transform my business into a force for community change. Carol Bennett's culinary program had expanded into a full-fledged vocational school, with branches in 12 cities. Success isn't just about learning a trade, she explained. It's about building confidence, creating community, and discovering your own worth. The boy's grandmother, now a nationally recognized advocate for family support reform, had just finished writing a book about their experience. Change doesn't happen in courtrooms alone, she said, her voice strong despite her years. It happens in living rooms, in kitchens, in the small moments when someone chooses to see beyond the surface and offer help instead of judgment. After the ceremony, the boy led a tour of the Resource Center for visitors from other cities. They stopped at a wall covered with photographs, hundreds of faces of program participants, each with their own story of transformation. Every face on this wall, he explained, represents not just one person, but an entire family, an entire community touched by change. In one corner of the center, a group of current participants was attending a workshop on starting small businesses, led by 3 former participants who had opened their own successful ventures. In another room, family support groups met in circles, sharing resources and hope just as they had once done in his grandmother's living room. The judge, now approaching retirement, pulled the boy aside during a quiet moment. You know, he said, that day in court, when you told the truth about your situation, you didn't just change your own life. You helped us all see that true justice isn't about punishment, it's about creating opportunities for transformation. Later that evening, as the crowds dispersed and the cameras left, the boy and his grandmother walked through their neighborhood. The same streets that had once felt like barriers now felt like pathways. They passed Mr. Tran's store, where a new group of young participants was learning inventory management. Through the windows of Carol's restaurant, they could see a cooking class in progress, filled with eager faces learning not just culinary skills, but self-confidence. They stopped at a small park that had once been neglected but was now well maintained by community volunteers. Children played on new equipment while parents chatted on nearby benches, sharing resources and support just as they had learned to do through the program. "Remember when you used to be afraid to tell anyone we were struggling?" his grandmother asked softly. The boy nodded, thinking back to those dark days. "Now people know it's okay to ask for help," he replied. That's maybe the biggest change of all. As they walked home, they passed a mother and son leaving the courthouse resource center. The boy recognized the look in the young boy's eyes, the same mix of fear and hope he had felt 2 years ago. Without hesitation, he stopped to share his story, just as he had done hundreds of times before. "The hardest step," he told the young boy, "is admitting you need help. The second hardest is accepting it. But after that, you'll be amazed at how many people want to support your success." That night, as he helped his grandmother prepare for another support group meeting in their living room, the boy reflected on how far they had come. The hunger that had driven him to steal had been transformed into a force for change that had touched thousands of lives. The shame that had once silenced him had become a voice that helped others find their own strength. "You know what I've learned," he said to his grandmother as they set out chairs. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of truth." She smiled, remembering that day in court. "And sometimes," she added, "what looks like an ending is really just a beginning." As their living room filled with families sharing stories and support, the boy understood that their journey wasn't over, it was still unfolding, touching new lives every day. The story that began with a hungry child facing a judge had grown into a movement that was redefining justice, community, and hope for an entire generation. Outside their window, the city lights twinkled against the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, another child might be facing the same desperate choices he once had. But now, thanks to the changes they had helped create, that child would find not judgment, but understanding, not punishment, but opportunity, not an ending, but a new beginning.